When I was 11 years old, I got a paper route in Altadena, California, and many years later that gave the inspiration for this one called Newspaper Throwing for Distance and Accuracy. There is more than one way to throw a newspaper. In those greener days when I was not quite so learned and sure, a boy was known by the way he threw a newspaper. We sometimes talked about it in the banding shack, gathered together in an aluminum structure hours before dawn. It was the only lighted place for blocks around, except for the street lights and the occasional neon signs of some stores that left them on forever. It was warm inside the shack. A tiny electric heater which the manager provided blew a whirring counterpoint to the crackling of rubber bands, making it a warm place for talking. Folding the newspapers never did prevent us from reading the headlines or talking about sports in enthusiastic voices. Some of us were older, some of different colors. We all had one thing in common. We needed the money. People would arrive or depart at scattered times as their bags became filled and they lugged them outside and lifted them onto their handlebars. There was always a moment of delay, as I suppose there always is when you're contemplating change from one activity to another. When my turn came, I caught a last minute of warmth from the heater, drew out a last few lines of parting from my friends, bundled up and swept the kickstand into place as bicycle and rider together went rolling down the crooked alleyway. In the morning before the dawn, I like to think of it as a brisk rather than cold, though I was glad when Christmas came and I was awarded a new pair of mittens. I would ride along in empty streets even before the milkman made his rounds, breathing the crispness of the air and sometimes wandering up in the canopy overhead that lay decked with blackest night and the stars in the west and faint hints of black-gray in the east. It was a different world in the morning. Before the day's noisy crowds and glare, I felt like an old stagehand sawing wood and placing nails, setting up the stage for the arrival of the players. It would have been easier, I suppose, if the streets were all flat. We lived halfway up the foothills and could almost reach the edge of civilization, knowing it by where the street lights left off. This made for stronger legs and harder work than the boys down the hill in the mid-city area. Each of us was presented with the problem of how best to cover his prescribed streets in the slanted plane and still end up near his house. This was a problem concerning street design, freshness at the start, weight of bags, which lessened as I went along, and the peculiarities of where some customers wished their newspapers placed. To go into all these details might be to make life more complicated than it really is. So for any potential newspaper throwers, or even just for newspaper receivers in hopes that they somehow can appreciate what they're getting, I will relate my contribution to the art of news flinging, the double shot. The double shot occurred quickly. I would be speeding down the hill, merrily delivering newspapers, when suddenly down the block, standing directly opposite one another, were two customers' houses with tiny porches and ivy-covered lawns daring delivery. Quickly, I reached into the right-hand bag to pull out a neatly folded paper and zip, toss it spinning flat and fast, parallel to the ground. Right hand on the handlebars, left hand onto left bag, roll and snap wrist to send it arching almost at right angles to the pavement. More wind resistance, more arch, less downhill travel. 3 houses down, plop, plop. They both landed on their respective porches, and I sped towards home. Last stop off was the donut shop with the little man who was just opening as I was just closing. I traded him a coffee and donut for a newspaper, and then sat a while talking with him and secretly wondering to myself why it was that I always played the outfield.
Thank you, Mark and Joseph.